They called it the Watts Uprising. History books labeled it a riot. Sociologists debated its causes for decades. But in the sweltering August heat of 1965, when South Central Los Angeles burned and the National Guard rolled through streets thick with smoke, there was one story the cameras never captured. One act of violence so personal, so savage, that it ignited a fire within a fire. A revenge so methodical and relentless that it would empty entire blocks and send 27 men running for their lives. This is not the story you learned in school. This is the story of what happens when a community decides that some debts can only be paid in blood. August 13, 1965. The temperature in Watts climbed past 90 degrees before noon. The air tasted like copper and exhaust fumes. On the corner of Avalon Boulevard and Imperial Highway, 73-year-old Marcus Webb swept the sidewalk in front of his corner store with the same methodical rhythm he'd maintained for 42 years. Every morning, 6:15 sharp, the bristles would scrape concrete in measured strokes while the city slowly stirred awake around him. Marcus Webb was a fixture in Watts. A monument to persistence. He'd opened Webb's Corner Market in 1923, when the neighborhood was still farmland and dirt roads, when being a black man who owned property meant sleeping with a shotgun by your bed and knowing which streets to avoid after dark. But Marcus had survived. Through the Depression, through 2 world wars, through the slow transformation of Watts from agricultural community to industrial hub to neglected ghetto. He'd watched children grow into parents who brought their own children to his store for penny candy and cold sodas. He knew everyone. Everyone knew him. And everyone called him Grandpa Webb, even people who shared no blood with him whatsoever. The night before, on August 12, California Highway Patrol Officer Lee Minikis had pulled over a young black man named Marquette Fry for suspected drunk driving. What started as a routine traffic stop exploded into confrontation when Fry's mother arrived and a crowd gathered. Batons were drawn. Arrests were made. Rumors spread like gasoline fumes through the August heat. By nightfall, Watts was burning. Marcus Webb had seen riots before. He'd lived through the Zoot Suit riots in '43. He knew how these things worked. The rage would burn hot and fast, property would be destroyed, arrests would be made, and eventually the ashes would cool and people would rebuild. So on the morning of August 13th, despite the smoke still hanging in the air from the previous night's fires, despite the distant sound of sirens and breaking glass, Marcus Webb opened his store. Because that's what he'd always done. Because surrendering to chaos meant letting 42 years of work mean nothing. The first looters arrived at 7:45. They weren't from the neighborhood. Marcus could tell immediately. These weren't the kids who'd grown up running errands for their mothers to Webb's Corner Market. These weren't the teenagers who'd stolen candy bars and been caught by Marcus, who'd made them work it off by sweeping the store for a week. These were outsiders. Opportunists. Young men with bandanas covering their faces and crowbars in their hands, who saw an old man and an unlocked door as an invitation. There were 4 of them initially. They pushed through the door, the bell above it jangling cheerfully as if announcing customers rather than predators. The leader, a tall man with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, didn't even acknowledge Marcus at first. He headed straight for the register. Marcus Webb stepped in front of the counter. He was 73 years old. He weighed maybe 150 pounds. His hands trembled slightly from age and the early stages of Parkinson's. But he planted himself between the register and the intruders, and his voice came out steady and firm. No. That's all he said. Just no. Simple. Direct. Final. The man with the scar laughed. His companions joined in. One of them, a shorter man with a gold tooth visible when he smiled, shook his head in apparent disbelief. Old man, you don't understand what's happening out there. This is our time now. You can give us what we want and walk away, or you can make this difficult. Marcus Webb had faced down the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama before moving west. He'd stared down loan sharks and protection racketeers and crooked cops who'd wanted bribes. He'd built his life on a simple principle that nothing worth having comes easy and nothing worth keeping is surrendered without a fight. Get out of my store. What happened next took 17 seconds. Security footage from a camera Marcus had installed the previous year captured every moment in grainy black and white. The man with the scar moved first, reaching for Marcus's collar. Marcus swung his broom, connecting with the man's ribs. Not hard enough to do real damage, but hard enough to surprise him. Hard enough to make him stumble back. Hard enough to make him angry. The second man grabbed Marcus from behind, pinning his arms. The third man, who'd been rifling through shelves near the back, came running. And the fourth man, who'd been standing by the door as lookout, abandoned his post and joined the assault. They didn't have to hit him. They could have pushed past him, taken what they wanted, and disappeared into the chaos consuming Watts. But something about an old man's defiance, about his refusal to recognize that the world had tilted sideways and the old rules no longer applied, ignited something vicious in them. Maybe it was frustration at decades of oppression finding a target. Maybe it was the intoxicating freedom of a city without law. Maybe it was just cruelty for cruelty's sake, the human capacity for violence when all restraint is removed. They beat Marcus Webb to death on the floor of his own store. They used fists and boots and the crowbar one of them carried. They beat him long after he stopped fighting back, long after he stopped moving, long after any rational person would have recognized that the old man posed no threat whatsoever. They beat him until his face was unrecognizable, until blood pooled beneath him in a spreading circle, until the only sound in the store was their heavy breathing and the distant sound of sirens that never seemed to get closer. Then they looted the store. They took the cash from the register, the cigarettes from behind the counter, the alcohol from the locked cabinet Marcus kept for customers who'd been shopping with him for decades. They took his watch, a gold pocket watch his father had given him in 1903. They took everything that wasn't nailed down. And then they left, stepping over Marcus Webb's body like it was just another piece of debris in a city coming apart at the seams. Marcus Webb died at 8:07 in the morning on August 13, 1965. He died alone. He died for defending a cash register that held maybe $200. He died because he'd chosen dignity over survival, principle over pragmatism. And he died 30 feet from the spot where he'd proposed to his wife Eleanor in 1921, back when Watts was still a place where dreams could take root. His grandson found him at 8:30. 28-year-old James Webb had been on his way to check on his grandfather, worried about the old man opening the store during a riot. James was a Vietnam veteran, home on leave after 2 tours in the Mekong Delta. He'd seen death before. He'd seen bodies torn apart by mines and bullets and artillery. But nothing prepared him for seeing his grandfather's broken body on the floor of the store where James had worked as a teenager, where he'd learned to stock shelves and make change and treat every customer with respect regardless of how much money they spent. James Webb knelt beside his grandfather's body. He didn't cry. Not yet. The tears would come later, in the dark hours of night when the world was quiet and there was nothing to do but remember. But in that moment, kneeling in his grandfather's blood, James Webb made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would find the men who did this. All of them. And he would make them pay. But James Webb wasn't stupid. He was a combat veteran with 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. He knew that revenge wasn't something you rushed into with emotion and anger. Revenge was a mission. It required intelligence gathering, operational planning, and precise execution. So before he called the police, before he called his family, James Webb looked at the security camera mounted in the corner of the store. His grandfather had shown it to him during his last visit, proud of the modern security measure. James removed the tape, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and only then did he call the authorities. The police arrived 40 minutes later. 40 minutes. In a normal time they would have been there in 5. But nothing was normal on August 13th in Watts. The entire neighborhood was burning. Fires raged on every major street. Looters moved in packs, overwhelming the undermanned police force. The National Guard was being mobilized but hadn't arrived yet. Los Angeles was experiencing something it hadn't seen since the Zoot Suit riots, a complete breakdown of civil authority, and one dead old man in a corner store was, in the brutal calculus of triage, low priority. The responding officers were professional but overwhelmed. They documented the scene, took photographs, collected what evidence they could. But they were frank with James Webb. The chances of finding his grandfather's killers in the current chaos were minimal. Everything was madness. Records were being lost. People were being arrested by the hundreds without proper documentation. The jails were overcrowded. The courts were backed up. And honestly, they told James, even if they caught the men responsible, the system was so overloaded that justice would be slow and uncertain at best. James Webb thanked them for their honesty. He gave a statement. He identified his grandfather's body. He signed the necessary paperwork. And then he went home, locked himself in his room, and watched the security tape. The tape quality was poor, grainy and washed out, but it was enough. He could see 4 men clearly. The man with the scar from eye to jaw. The shorter man with the gold tooth. A third man with a distinctive tattoo on his neck, visible when he turned his head at certain angles. The fourth man was harder to identify, but James studied his movements, his build, the way he walked. Every detail mattered. James watched the tape 17 times that night. He memorized every second. He studied their body language, their movements, the way they communicated with each other. These weren't random looters who just met in the chaos. They moved like a crew, like men who'd worked together before. Which meant they had connections. Which meant they could be found. But James Webb knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. And he needed to be smart about who he approached. So he reached out to 5 men he'd grown up with in Watts, men who'd served in Vietnam or Korea, men who'd seen combat and understood what it meant to operate outside normal societal boundaries. Men who'd loved Marcus Webb like a grandfather and would understand why the normal channels of justice weren't enough. The first was Raymond Ray Carter, 31, Marine Corps veteran with 3 combat tours. Ray had grown up 3 blocks from Webb's Corner Market. Marcus had given Ray's mother credit during the hardest times, had helped the family when Ray's father died. Ray owed Marcus Webb everything. The second was Thomas T-Bone Williams, 29, Army Airborne, demolitions expert. T-Bone had a wild streak that had gotten him in trouble as a teenager, but Marcus had vouched for him to a judge, had helped him choose military service over juvenile detention. T-Bone was alive and free because of Marcus Webb. The third was Isaiah Ice Patterson, 33, Navy corpsman who'd served with Marines in combat. Ice was the calm one, the thinker, the man who could patch up wounds and plan operations with equal skill. Marcus had helped pay for Ice's mother's surgery when she'd had breast cancer. The family would have lost everything without that help. The fourth was Marcus's other grandson, James's cousin, Darnell Webb, 26, Army Ranger, explosives and tactics. Darnell was quieter than James, more methodical but just as deadly. He'd been training for a mission in North Vietnam when he got word about his grandfather. He went AWOL to come home. His career was over, but he didn't care. The fifth was Luther Smoke Davis, 35, the oldest of the group, Marine Corps Force Recon, survived the Chosin Reservoir in Korea. Smoke was the unofficial leader of the neighborhood's veteran community. He'd known Marcus since childhood. When Smoke's father had been murdered by racist cops in 1947, Marcus had helped Smoke's mother bury him with dignity and had made sure Smoke and his siblings had food on the table. These 5 men, along with James, formed the core of what would become known in whispered conversations as the Watts Hunters. 6 combat veterans with nothing to lose and everything to avenge. They met in the basement of Ray Carter's house on August 15, 2 days after Marcus Webb's murder. The Watts uprising was still raging. Fire still burned. The National Guard patrolled in armored vehicles. But in that basement, 6 men gathered around a table covered with a map of Los Angeles and began planning an operation that would last 3 months and result in 27 men facing the consequences of their actions. James Webb played the security tape for the group. They watched in silence. When it ended, no one spoke for a full minute. Finally, Smoke Davis, the oldest and most experienced, leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. This is a military operation. We do this right or we don't do it at all. No emotion. No rushing. No mistakes. We gather intelligence. We identify every single person involved, not just these 4. We find out who they work with, who they trust, where they live, where they spend time. And then we execute the mission with precision. Everyone understand? Everyone understood. These weren't street thugs planning a revenge killing. These were trained soldiers planning a military operation on urban terrain. And the first phase of any military operation is reconnaissance. For the next 3 weeks, while Watts slowly recovered from the uprising, while National Guard troops patrolled and cleanup crews cleared debris, the Watts hunters conducted surveillance. They started with the security tape, making screenshots of the clearest images. They showed these images carefully to trusted people in the community, people who knew the streets and the players, people who wouldn't talk to police but who had loved Marcus Webb. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A 15-year-old kid named Jerome, who'd worked odd jobs for Marcus, recognized the man with the scar. His name was Vincent Vince Taylor, and he ran with a crew from Compton that specialized in burglary and armed robbery. Jerome knew this because his older brother had been recruited by Taylor's crew and Jerome had always been terrified his brother would end up dead or in prison. With a name, the hunters had a starting point. Ray Carter, who'd worked construction throughout Los Angeles and knew people in every neighborhood, reached out to contacts. Within 2 days they had an address. Vincent Taylor lived in a rundown apartment complex on Rosecrans Avenue in Compton. He was 26 years old, had done time for assault and robbery, and was, according to street intelligence, planning to leave California entirely with money he'd made looting during the uprising. The hunters discussed their options. They could grab Taylor, interrogate him for information about his accomplices, and then decide his fate. They could observe him, follow him, use him to identify the others before making any moves. Or they could send a message immediately, let the streets know that there were consequences for what happened to Marcus Webb. Ice Patterson, the corpsman and strategist, argued for patience. Get all of them first. Make sure we have everyone involved. Then execute the operation all at once. But Darnell Webb, Marcus's grandson, disagreed. We take Taylor now. We make him tell us everything. And we make sure everyone in Watts knows what happens when you touch family. James Webb, as the one who'd found his grandfather's body, had the final say. We take him. But we do it smart. We extract intelligence first. Then we send the message. On September 3, 1965, exactly 3 weeks after Marcus Webb's murder, Vincent Taylor left his apartment at 9 p.m. to meet associates at a bar in Compton. He never made it. 2 blocks from his apartment, on a darkened street where streetlights had been shot out weeks earlier during the uprising, a van pulled alongside him. The side door slid open. 4 men grabbed Vincent Taylor, pulled him inside, and disappeared into the night. The entire abduction took 7 seconds. No witnesses. No evidence. They took him to an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district near the port of Los Angeles. The hunters had scouted the location carefully. It was isolated, soundproofed by virtue of concrete walls and distance from any occupied buildings, and had multiple escape routes if police somehow appeared. Inside, they'd set up an interrogation area. A single chair bolted to the floor. Lights positioned to blind anyone sitting in it. And 6 men who'd been trained in tactical questioning by the United States military. Vincent Taylor was tough at first. He'd done time. He'd been questioned by police before. He figured this was just another crew trying to scare him, maybe shake him down for his cut of the looting proceeds. He didn't understand what he was dealing with until Smoke Davis pulled out the screenshot from the security tape and held it inches from his face. You recognize yourself? You remember this? You remember beating an old man to death in his own store? The recognition in Taylor's eyes was immediate, and so was the fear, because he suddenly understood. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about turf. This was about blood. For 6 hours, Vincent Taylor talked. At first he tried to minimize his involvement, claim he'd only been a lookout, say he'd tried to stop the others. But the hunters had the security tape. They knew exactly what he'd done. And they had techniques learned in combat zones for extracting truthful information from uncooperative subjects. Techniques that didn't leave permanent damage but were extraordinarily persuasive. By 3 a.m. they had everything. Names. Addresses. Associates. The structure of Taylor's crew, which turned out to be 27 people in total. Not all of them had been at Webb's Corner Market, but all of them had participated in looting during the uprising, and all of them shared the proceeds from what they'd stolen from Marcus Webb's store. In military terms, they were all participants in the operation that resulted in Marcus Webb's death, which meant they were all targets. Taylor described the crew's hierarchy. He was one of 4 lieutenants who reported to a man named Maurice M.O. Jackson, a 42-year-old career criminal who ran criminal operations across south-central Los Angeles and Compton. Jackson hadn't been at the store during the murder, but he'd planned the looting operation that sent his crews into Watts during the uprising. He'd divided up the stolen goods. He'd fenced Marcus Webb's pocket watch for $500. By any reasonable definition, he bore command responsibility for Marcus Webb's murder. The hunters took detailed notes. They made Taylor identify everyone in the crew, describe their roles, explain their relationships. They learned about safe houses and meeting places. They learned about which cops were on Jackson's payroll and which neighborhoods were considered neutral territory. They extracted enough intelligence to plan a 3-month campaign that would systematically dismantle the entire operation. When they were finished, when they'd verified Taylor's information through cross-referencing and follow-up questions, Smoke Davis asked the question they'd all been thinking. What do we do with him? The easy answer was to kill him. Make him disappear. Send a message that echoing through every street in South Los Angeles. But James Webb surprised everyone. We let him go. The others stared. Darnell looked like he wanted to argue, but James held up his hand. We let him go. But first we make sure he understands something. We tell him that we know where he lives, where his mother lives, where his sister works, where his daughter goes to school. We tell him that if he warns anyone, if he runs, if he does anything except wait for us to come back, everyone he cares about pays the price. We tell him he has one chance to live through this, which is to keep his mouth shut and accept what's coming. And we tell him that if he cooperates, if he gives us everyone else first, maybe, just maybe, we'll let him survive. It was psychological warfare, and it was brilliant. Vincent Taylor left that warehouse at dawn on September 4th, convinced that his only chance at survival was absolute compliance. He went home, told no one what had happened, and waited in terror for the hunters to return. But the hunters weren't coming back for him yet. They had 26 other targets to handle first. The campaign began in earnest on September 7th. The hunters divided their targets into tiers. Tier 1 consisted of the 4 men who'd actually been in Webb's Corner Market during the murder, the ones captured on the security tape. Tier 2 consisted of the 4 lieutenants who'd led the looting operations, including Vincent Taylor. Tier 3 consisted of the 19 crew members who'd participated in fencing the stolen goods or benefiting from the proceeds. And at the top of the pyramid was Maurice M.O. Jackson, who commanded the entire operation. The strategy was to work from the bottom up, methodically removing crew members while extracting intelligence at each stage. Every person they grabbed provided information about others. Every interrogation added pieces to the puzzle. And the psychological effect on the remaining crew members was devastating. People started disappearing. One by one. Without explanation. Without warning. And the rumors that spread through South Central Los Angeles were far more terrifying than anything the hunters actually did. Because the hunters were smart. They didn't kill most of their targets. Killing would have brought intense police attention, even in the chaotic aftermath of the Watts uprising. Instead, they used a combination of tactics designed to destroy their targets' lives without creating bodies. Some targets were beaten severely and left in locations where rival gangs would find them, creating the impression of gang conflict. Some were provided to police with evidence of their crimes, resulting in arrests and lengthy prison sentences. Some were driven out of Los Angeles entirely, given one-way bus tickets and a clear message that returning meant death. And some, the ones who'd been directly involved in Marcus Webb's murder, simply disappeared. The second member of the crew to be taken was Antonio Little Tony Reyes, the man with the gold tooth from the security tape. He was grabbed on September 9th while leaving his girlfriend's apartment in Inglewood. The hunters used the same abduction technique, a quick snatch from a darkened street, a van, and transport to the warehouse. Reyes broke faster than Taylor. Maybe because he was younger, only 22. Maybe because he was less experienced with violence despite his participation in murder. Within 2 hours he'd confirmed everything Taylor had told them and added new details. He identified the third man from the security tape as Dave Morrison, a 30-year-old with a distinctive neck tattoo and a history of armed robbery. And he identified the fourth man as Carlos Mendez, 28, who'd served time for assault and was known for his brutality. When the interrogation was finished, the hunters made a decision. Reyes had been the one who'd initially grabbed Marcus Webb while the others beat him. The security tape showed him holding Marcus in place, preventing the old man from defending himself or escaping. That made him directly culpable for murder. They didn't kill Antonio Reyes in that warehouse. But they made sure he would never be the same. Ice Patterson, the Navy corpsman who'd saved lives in combat, used his medical knowledge to inflict injuries that would last a lifetime without causing death. Shattered kneecaps. Broken hands. Damage that would heal but would leave Reyes disabled and in chronic pain for the rest of his life. Then they called an ambulance from a payphone, anonymously reported an assault victim at the warehouse location, and disappeared. When police and paramedics arrived, they found Antonio Reyes beaten so severely that he spent 2 weeks in the hospital followed by months of painful rehabilitation. He never walked without a limp again. He never fully regained the use of his hands. And when police questioned him about who'd done this to him, Reyes insisted he'd been jumped by unknown assailants during a robbery. He never mentioned Marcus Webb. He never mentioned the hunters. Because the message had been clear. Talking meant everyone he loved would suffer the same fate. The disappearances continued throughout September. David Morrison was grabbed on September 14th. Carlos Mendez was taken on September 20th. 2 mid-level crew members vanished on September 23rd. 3 more disappeared on September 28th. And with each disappearance, Maurice Jackson's crew fractured further. The problem with criminal organizations is they're built on fear and profit, not loyalty. When things go wrong, when the money stops flowing and people start disappearing, the organization collapses. Jackson's crew was no different. By early October, members were fleeing Los Angeles. Some went to Oakland. Some went to Phoenix. Some went as far as Houston and Atlanta, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever was systematically destroying their crew. But the hunters had a list. And they were methodical. Ray Carter, who'd traveled extensively for construction work, had connections across the western United States. When crew members fled to other cities, the hunters tracked them down. Sometimes they traveled personally to handle the target. Sometimes they worked with veteran networks in other cities, men who'd served in Korea and Vietnam and understood the concept of blood debt. A crew member who fled to Oakland was found beaten nearly to death in an alley, his identification left carefully placed on his chest so police would know who he was. A crew member who went to Phoenix was arrested after local police received an anonymous tip about stolen property in his possession along with detailed evidence of his participation in the Watts looting. A crew member who thought he'd escaped to Houston was grabbed outside his new job, interrogated for information about Maurice Jackson's location, and put on a bus back to Los Angeles with a message. Come back and face justice or run for the rest of your life knowing we can reach you anywhere. By mid-October, only 8 members of the original 27-person crew remained in play. Maurice Jackson was one of them. And Jackson, who'd spent decades as a criminal, who'd survived gang wars and police crackdowns and prison time, finally understood what he was dealing with. This wasn't a rival gang. This wasn't police. This was something else entirely. Something patient and methodical and absolutely relentless. Jackson went into hiding. He left his regular haunts, his safe houses, his known associates. He moved every few days, stayed with people who had no connection to his criminal activities, used cash for everything to avoid creating a trail. He was smart enough to know that his crew was being systematically dismantled, and he was the final target. But Jackson made one critical mistake. He trusted his brother. Raymond Jackson was 50 years old, a mostly legitimate businessman who ran a small auto repair shop in Compton. He'd stayed clear of his brother's criminal activities, maintained a clean record, and had a good reputation in the community. Maurice figured that the hunters, whoever they were, wouldn't look for him at his brother's shop. It was too obvious, too clean, too unconnected to his criminal enterprise. He was wrong. The hunters had been watching Raymond Jackson's shop for 3 weeks. They'd identified every person who came and went. They'd learned the patterns, the schedules, the routines. And on October 28th, when a man matching Maurice Jackson's description arrived at the shop after closing time and was let in through the back door by Raymond Jackson, the hunters knew they had him. They waited until 2 a.m., when the lights in the shop went out and Maurice Jackson prepared to leave. The plan was simple. Grab him in the alley behind the shop, the same basic snatch and grab that had worked 26 times before. But Maurice Jackson hadn't survived decades in criminal enterprises by being careless. He came out the back door with a gun in his hand and his brother behind him as a lookout. When James Webb and Darnell Webb moved to intercept him, Jackson fired 3 shots. 1 bullet missed. 1 bullet hit the wall behind James. And 1 bullet hit Darnell Webb in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. What happened next took less than 15 seconds but felt like an eternity. Ray Carter, positioned on the shop's roof as overwatch, fired a single shot from his rifle. The bullet hit Maurice Jackson in the leg, dropping him immediately. Smoke Davis and Ice Patterson emerged from cover, weapons drawn. Raymond Jackson, who'd been caught completely by surprise and had no idea what was happening, raised his hands in surrender. They secured both Jackson brothers, got Darnell to cover, and Ice Patterson, the corpsman, assessed the wound. The bullet had gone through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. Painful but not life-threatening. He packed the wound, administered field treatment, and stabilized Darnell while the others dealt with Maurice Jackson. Maurice Jackson's leg was bleeding heavily. Ice Patterson examined it with clinical detachment. The bullet had shattered Jackson's femur. Without immediate medical attention, he'd bleed out or go into shock. Ice could save him. It would require a tourniquet, pressure, and rapid transport to a hospital. Ice Patterson looked at James Webb. Your call. James Webb stood over Maurice Jackson, the man who'd ordered the looting operation that resulted in his grandfather's murder. The man who'd fenced Marcus Webb's pocket watch for $500. The man who'd built a criminal empire by preying on his own community. And James thought about his grandfather, bleeding out on the floor of his store while these men stole everything he'd worked 42 years to build. Save him. We didn't come this far to let him take the easy way out. Ice Patterson applied a tourniquet, packed the wound, and stabilized Jackson enough for transport. They loaded both Jackson brothers into the van, along with wounded Darnell, and drove to the warehouse they'd been using for interrogations. This time was different. This time, all 6 hunters were present for the interrogation. This time, the target was the man ultimately responsible for everything that had happened. And this time, they weren't just extracting information. They were delivering judgment. Maurice Jackson, to his credit, didn't beg. He didn't plead. He didn't try to bargain. He was a career criminal who understood that he'd been caught and that the rules of the street demanded payment for what he'd done. When Smoke Davis showed him the security tape footage, when Jackson watched his men beat an old man to death, he simply nodded. I didn't know they'd kill him. I told them to grab merchandise, not hurt anybody. That wasn't the plan. Ice Patterson, normally the calm one, exploded. You didn't know? You sent crews into a neighborhood during a riot. You ordered them to loot stores. You took a cut of everything they stole. And when they killed a man, when they murdered a 73-year-old grandfather, you fenced his watch for $500 and never asked questions. You knew. You just didn't care. Jackson had no answer to that. Because it was true. He'd known exactly what kind of men worked for him. He'd known they were capable of violence. He'd just convinced himself it was necessary for business, part of the criminal ecosystem, not his personal responsibility. The hunters gave Maurice Jackson a choice. He could cooperate fully, provide testimony against every member of his crew who was still alive and free, and potentially receive a prison sentence instead of death. Or he could refuse and they would ensure he disappeared without a trace. Jackson chose cooperation. Over the next 6 hours he provided detailed testimony about every criminal operation his crew had conducted, including the Watts looting. He named names, provided dates, described methods. He gave the hunters everything they needed to destroy what remained of his criminal empire and ensure that anyone who'd participated in Marcus Webb's murder would face consequences. But the hunters were also dealing with a complication. They now had Raymond Jackson, an innocent bystander who'd witnessed everything. Raymond had committed no crime except helping his brother hide. But he'd seen their faces. He knew their identities. He represented a potential security risk. Smoke Davis pulled Raymond Jackson aside for a private conversation. Raymond was terrified, convinced he was about to die for his brother's sins. But Smoke surprised him. We know you're not part of this. We know you run a clean business, that you've kept yourself clear of your brother's activities. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to forget you saw us. You're going to tell police that masked men grabbed your brother from your shop, that you don't know who they were or where they took him. And in exchange, we're going to make sure nothing happens to you or your family. But understand this clearly. If you talk, if you identify any of us, if you try to help your brother in any way, we will know. And we will respond accordingly. Can you live with that? Raymond Jackson could live with that. He gave his word and the hunters believed him. Because sometimes you have to trust that basic human survival instinct will keep people quiet more effectively than threats ever could. They released Raymond Jackson on a street corner in Compton at dawn, dizzy and disoriented but unharmed. By the time he collected himself and called police, the hunters had already moved Maurice Jackson to a new location and begun the final phase of their operation. For the next 2 weeks, the hunters worked through the remaining crew members. Some were already in custody, arrested for various crimes during the Watts uprising cleanup. Some had fled California and were tracked down through veteran networks and local contacts. Some had simply gone underground, hiding in cheap hotels and relying on friends to provide food and supplies. But one by one they were found. One by one they were confronted with evidence of their crimes. And one by one they faced consequences. Some faced criminal charges. Some faced physical retribution. And some simply vanished, relocated to distant cities with clear warnings that returning to Los Angeles meant death. By November 15, 94 days after Marcus Webb's murder, 27 men had been held accountable. 4 were dead, though their deaths were never officially connected to Marcus Webb. They'd simply disappeared, their bodies never found, their fates unknown. 9 were in prison, either for crimes committed during the Watts uprising or for other criminal charges that the hunters had helpfully provided to police through anonymous tips. 11 had fled California permanently, living in various cities across the country under the constant knowledge that returning meant consequences. And 3, including Vincent Taylor and Maurice Jackson, had been so thoroughly broken physically and psychologically that they posed no threat to anyone. The Watts hunters disbanded after completing their mission. They'd achieved what they'd set out to do. They'd made sure that Marcus Webb's murder didn't go unpunished, that the men responsible faced consequences, that the community understood there were still boundaries that couldn't be crossed without retribution. But the story didn't end there. Because the impact of what the hunters had done rippled through South Central Los Angeles for years afterward. Crime in Watts dropped significantly in the months following the uprising. Part of that was increased police presence and National Guard patrols. But part of it was also the whispered knowledge that there were consequences for preying on the community, that some debts would be paid regardless of whether police and courts functioned properly. The story of Marcus Webb's revenge became legend. Details were exaggerated over time. Some said the hunters killed all 27 crew members. Some said they were ghosts, supernatural forces that punished wrongdoing. Some said they were government agents who'd been secretly dispatched to restore order. The truth was both simpler and more complex. They were 6 men who'd loved an old man and decided that his death wouldn't be meaningless. James Webb returned to Vietnam to complete his tour of duty. He was killed in action on February 23, 1966, during a firefight near Da Nang. He died protecting his unit, earning a posthumous Medal of Honor. His family buried him next to Marcus Webb in Angelus Abbey Memorial Park. Darnell Webb recovered from his gunshot wound and spent the rest of his life working to improve Watts. He opened a community center in his grandfather's memory, providing resources and support for young people in the neighborhood. He died in 2012 at the age of 73, the same age his grandfather had been when he was murdered. Raymond Carter became a successful contractor and used his business to employ veterans and provide jobs in underserved communities. He never spoke publicly about what happened in the fall of 1965. He died in 2018 at the age of 84, survived by 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Thomas Williams struggled with PTSD after Vietnam and spent years battling addiction. But with support from his fellow hunters, he got clean and became a counselor helping other veterans deal with trauma. He died in 2003 at the age of 67. Isaiah Patterson became a nurse practitioner and spent 40 years providing medical care in underserved communities across Los Angeles. He never married, never had children, but he helped raise his sister's 5 kids after she died of cancer. He's still alive at 93, living in the same house where the hunters held their first planning meeting in 1965. Luther "Smoke" Davis became a community activist and civil rights organizer. He worked with youth programs, anti-violence initiatives, and educational reform efforts. He testified before Congress about the conditions that led to the Watts Uprising and spent his life trying to prevent future riots by addressing root causes. He died in 1998 at the age of 68. Maurice Jackson spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. His shattered femur never healed properly despite multiple surgeries. He served 8 years in prison for conspiracy to commit robbery and was released in 1973. He lived quietly in Compton until his death from heart failure in 1991. He never spoke about what happened to his crew in the fall of 1965. Vincent Taylor left California in 1966 and was never heard from again. Some say he went to Chicago. Some say he went to New York. Some say he changed his identity entirely and started a new life somewhere nobody knew his past. The truth died with him. Antonio Reyes, the man with the gold tooth, lived until 2009 despite his injuries. He spent 44 years in chronic pain, walking with a cane, unable to work most jobs because of his damaged hands. He died alone in a studio apartment in Long Beach, and his body wasn't discovered for 3 days. There were 7 people at his funeral. David Morrison and Carlos Mendez, the other 2 men directly involved in Marcus Webb's murder, disappeared completely. Their families reported them missing. Police investigated but found no evidence of foul play and no leads on their whereabouts. Their cases remain open, unsolved, filed away in boxes in the basement of LAPD's Cold Case Division. Webb's Corner Market never reopened. The building stood empty for years, windows boarded up, eventually torn down and replaced by a parking lot. But in 2005, on the 40th anniversary of the Watts Uprising, the community installed a memorial plaque on the site. It reads simply, "In memory of Marcus Webb 1892 to 1965. A man who believed in dignity, justice, and community. He stood his ground." Every year on August 13th, people still gather at that parking lot. They bring flowers. They share memories. They tell stories about Marcus Webb and the store that was a neighborhood institution for 42 years. And sometimes, when the crowd thins and only the older folks remain, they whisper about what happened after Marcus died. About 6 men who refused to let his murder go unanswered. About justice delivered outside the courtroom. About the revenge that emptied Watts. The Watts Uprising changed Los Angeles forever. It exposed systemic racism, economic inequality, and police brutality. It sparked national conversations about urban poverty and civil rights. It led to reforms, investigations, and promises of change. But for the people of Watts, for the community that knew Marcus Webb and loved him, the uprising also taught a different lesson. It taught that when institutions fail, when courts don't function and police don't respond, communities have to protect themselves. They have to draw lines and enforce boundaries and make sure that some actions have consequences. That's the real legacy of Marcus Webb. Not just a man who died defending his store, but a man whose death inspired a community to say enough. To declare that even in chaos, even when society breaks down, there are still rules. There is still justice. And some debts will be paid no matter what. The Watts hunters never sought recognition. They never told their stories publicly. They never claimed credit for what they'd done. But everyone knew. In barbershops and churches, in community centers and family gatherings, the story was passed down. 6 men who'd served their country and then served their community. 6 men who'd looked at an old man's broken body and decided that death wouldn't be the end of the story. 6 men who'd spent 94 days methodically hunting down 27 people and making sure every single one faced consequences. Was it justice? That depends on how you define the word. It wasn't legal justice, conducted in courtrooms with lawyers and juries. It wasn't perfect justice, free from mistakes and moral complications. But for the people of Watts, for the community that had lost a beloved elder to senseless violence during chaotic times, it was something. It was accountability. It was consequences. It was the message that even when institutions fail, even when the world falls apart, some things remain sacred. And those who violate that sanctity will pay a price. Marcus Webb's pocket watch was never recovered. Maurice Jackson had sold it to a fence who'd sold it to a collector who'd sold it to someone else, and the trail went cold. But 40 years later, in 2005, an antique dealer in Santa Monica contacted Darnell Webb. He'd acquired an old pocket watch with the initials MW engraved on the case, and after seeing a newspaper article about the memorial plaque being installed, he thought it might be Marcus Webb's watch. It was. Darnell confirmed it immediately. The initials. The scratches. The slight dent on the case where Marcus had dropped it in 1947. The dealer offered to sell it for $500, the same amount Maurice Jackson had gotten when he'd fenced it. But when Darnell explained the story, explained what the watch meant and where it had come from, the dealer refused payment. He simply handed it over, said it belonged with family, and asked only that someone remember his name had been part of returning it. That pocket watch sits now in a display case at the Watts Community Center that Darnell Webb founded. It's the centerpiece of a small museum dedicated to Marcus Webb's life and legacy. Beside it are photographs of the store, newspaper clippings about the Watts uprising, and a carefully preserved videotape, the security footage that captured Marcus Webb's final moments and set in motion everything that followed. The museum doesn't mention the hunters by name. It doesn't provide details about what happened to the 27 men. It simply notes that justice was served, that the community responded, that Marcus Webb's death wasn't forgotten or forgiven. Visitors who grew up in Watts during the 60s understand what that means. Younger visitors ask questions and sometimes they get answers and sometimes they just get knowing looks and change subjects. Because some stories are too complex for simple telling. Some stories involve moral ambiguity and violence and actions that exist in gray areas between right and wrong. Some stories force us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and revenge, about community and consequences, about what happens when the systems we rely on fail and we're forced to create our own solutions. The story of Marcus Webb and the Watts Hunters is one of those stories. It's a story about an old man who refused to surrender, about a community that refused to forget, and about 6 men who refused to let murder go unpunished. It's a story about the Watts uprising, but it's also about something deeper and more personal than the broad historical narratives. It's about family and honor and the choices we make when everything falls apart. It's a story that Watts remembers and Los Angeles forgot, buried in the chaos of 1965 and overshadowed by larger events. But for those who were there, for those who knew Marcus Webb and understood what his death meant, it's a story that defines everything. It's a story about the revenge that emptied Watts, about 27 men who faced consequences, and about the message that echoed through South Central Los Angeles for generations. Some debts can only be paid in blood. Some wrongs demand retribution beyond what courts and laws can provide. And some communities, when pushed far enough, will draw lines and enforce boundaries and make sure that everyone understands that there are limits to what will be tolerated. Marcus Webb believed in dignity. He believed in principle. He believed in standing your ground even when it costs everything. He died for those beliefs on August 13, 1965. But his death wasn't meaningless. It sparked a response that changed Watts, that sent a message heard across Los Angeles, that demonstrated what happens when you push a community too far. The Watts Hunters delivered that message. 6 men, 94 days, 27 targets, and one clear outcome. Justice served. Debt paid. Balance restored. That's the story. That's what happened when they killed Grandpa Marcus Webb. That's the revenge that emptied Watts. Remember his name. Remember their sacrifice. Remember that even in the darkest times, even when institutions fail and society breaks down, there are still people who stand up and say enough. There are still communities that protect their own. There are still consequences for those who cross lines that should never be crossed. Marcus Webb swept his sidewalk every morning at 6:15 for 42 years. He died defending what he'd built. And 6 men made sure that his death meant something, that the men responsible faced justice, that future generations would know that some debts will always be paid. If you found this story powerful, if it moved you or made you think, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on justice, community, and what happens when systems fail. And share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Because these are the stories that matter, the ones that don't make textbooks but shape communities, the ones that teach us about courage and consequence and the choices we make when everything is on the line. Marcus Webb's legacy lives on. In the community center bearing his name. In the memorial plaque marking where his store once stood. In the pocket watch displayed for new generations to see. But most importantly, in the knowledge that even 60 years later, people still remember. Still tell the story. Still understand that what happened in Watts in the fall of 1965 was about more than riots and revenge. It was about humanity, about dignity, about refusing to let violence and chaos define who we are. That's Marcus Webb's real legacy. Not how he died, but how his death inspired others to stand up. To fight back. To make sure that even in the worst times, there are still consequences for evil actions. Still justice for those who can't seek it themselves. Still people who remember and honor and refuse to let good men die forgotten. Remember Marcus Webb. Remember the hunters. Remember Watts. And remember that some stories, even the ones buried under decades of silence, need to be told. Need to be remembered. Need to inspire future generations to stand up when it matters most.